There's a dangerous moment when emotion takes the wheel and you only realize it after you've already said too much, reacted too much, explained too much. And then comes that silent hangover. Your mind replaying the scene like you could go back in time, your chest tightening with the feeling of shame and a question nobody likes to face honestly. Why couldn't I control myself? Most people don't suffer because they feel. They suffer because they're dragged along by what they feel. They suffer because in the heat of the moment, emotion turns into destiny. A snide comment becomes a personal offense. A silence becomes rejection. A delay becomes abandonment. A criticism becomes a verdict. And when you live like that, the whole world seems to have a button that can throw you off balance. All it takes is for someone to push it, and you lose your center. Maybe you know this kind of exhaustion. It's not just being tired from work, routine, or responsibilities. It's being tired of yourself, of your own reactions, of your own mind. Tired of promising you'll change and repeating the same pattern. Tired of feeling strong one day and fragile the next. Tired of depending on other people's moods to have peace. And the worst, tired of not knowing exactly what to do to flip that switch for good. There's a common illusion that keeps this cycle alive. The idea that controlling emotion means suffocating emotion. As if self-control means turning to stone. As if maturity means feeling nothing. But that's not maturity, that's anesthesia. And anesthesia has a price. You don't feel the pain, but you also lose sensitivity to life. The ancient Stoics didn't seek a frozen existence. They sought inner freedom. They wanted to feel without being enslaved. They wanted to cross the world without letting anything from outside knock down what's essential inside. And here's a distinction that changes everything. Emotion isn't the enemy. It's a message. The problem isn't feeling anger. It's being possessed by anger. The problem isn't feeling sadness. It's sinking into sadness like it's an identity. The problem isn't feeling fear. It's building your whole life from fear. The Stoic doesn't declare war on the heart. He educates the heart. He trains the mind to see clearly and, with that, choose a response more worthy than an automatic reaction. When someone says they want to become emotionally untouchable, a lot of people get it wrong, like it means turning arrogant, cold, unreachable. But there's a noble version of that expression. It doesn't mean nothing touches you. It means nothing controls you. It means people can talk, provoke, insinuate, try to pull you into chaos, and still you remain standing inside. Not because you won an argument, but because you didn't lose yourself. Think about how many times your day was decided by something small. A bad news story in the morning and you lose hope. A silly argument and you lose patience. A dirty look and you lose your mood. A simple mistake and you lose self-esteem. That's not sensitivity. That's vulnerability without direction. It's living with your emotional system exposed, without a conscious filter, like a house without doors. Any wind comes in. Any person comes in. Any comment rearranges your inner furniture. The Stoics would call this a reactive life, a life where you don't act, you react. And a reactive person can be brilliant, competent, charismatic, but inside lives in instability, because their center is outside, never inside. Their center is approval, its recognition, its predictability, its control of the environment. But the world doesn't sign a predictability contract with anyone. The world changes, people change, the body changes, opinion changes. And if your peace depends on what changes, your peace becomes a hostage. Stoic freedom starts when you understand something simple and harsh. You don't control what happens, but you can learn to control what happens inside you when things happen. That inside isn't some mystical distant place. It's very concrete. It's the interpretation you give to the fact. It's the story your mind creates. It's the image you make of yourself. It's the kind of thought you feed. For the Stoic, between the stimulus and the response, there's a space. And in that space lives your dignity. But why is this so hard in practice? Because emotion is fast. It's ancient. It comes from instincts, memories, wounds, habits. It doesn't ask permission. It rises like fire. And if you've never trained, you obey. Only after do you think, only after do you regret. Stoic training, therefore, isn't a pretty speech. It's a daily discipline to expand that space between stimulus and response. It's the training of not being hijacked. And here's a useful image. Imagine two people facing the same insult. One explodes and loses the day. The other breathes, observes, responds with firmness, or doesn't respond at all, and moves on. What changed wasn't the insult. The insult was the same. What changed was the inner architecture. One person had fragile walls, the other had a foundation. One person interpreted it as an attack on identity, the other interpreted it as noise coming from outside. One person needed to win, the other needed to remain whole. That's what modern Stoics reclaim. It's not about seeming invincible, it's about being unshakable in what matters. There's also a detail. A lot of people believe self-control is a matter of willpower. But willpower alone is like trying to hold a river with your hands. You hold on for a while, then it slips. What works is habit. What works is vision. What works is attention training. It's reorganizing the mind so that emotional control is a natural consequence of a life philosophy, not a desperate effort in every situation. That's exactly why habits matter. Habit is what you do when you're not thinking. Habit is your default response. And if your default response is explaining too much, attacking, running, being sarcastic, staying silent with resentment, eating the anger inside, seeking validation, then, in moments of pressure, you'll repeat it. Life doesn't test your intention. Life tests your conditioning. And the Stoic understands, if I don't train on the ordinary day, I'll fail on the hard day. What will be explored ahead is a set of practices that the Stoics, in different ways, already pointed out centuries ago, and that remain current because human nature hasn't changed. Screens changed, notifications, the speed of the world. But the human mind still tends to interpret, exaggerate, anticipate tragedies, collect grudges, seek approval, fear rejection. The difference is that today these traps are fed all the time. Social media, comparisons, opinions, daily indignations, non-stop stimuli. In a world like that, mastering your own emotion isn't a luxury, it's psychological survival. And here's a realistic promise, without fantasy. You won't stop emotions from arising, but you can stop them from commanding. You can learn to observe anger without becoming anger. You can learn to feel sadness without becoming despair. You can learn to notice fear without becoming cowardice. You can learn to receive criticism without becoming humiliation. You can learn to be provoked without becoming aggression. That's being untouchable in the most human sense, being faithful to your own center. Maybe right now, you're thinking of someone who seems to have this mastery, someone who doesn't get shaken easily. Or maybe you're remembering yourself in rare moments when you managed to respond calmly and then felt silent pride. The good news is that this isn't a gift. It's construction. It's a type of maturity that you learn. And the first step is to stop treating emotion as an excuse and start treating it as raw material. The emotion comes. The choice is yours. You transform it into wisdom or into damage. Before any practice, there's an internal commitment that changes the game. I'm not going to hand my center over to the world anymore. Because as long as you believe you need the last word, as long as you believe you need to be understood by everyone, as long as you believe you need to be approved to have value, anyone can manipulate you. All they have to do is touch your pride, your neediness, your old wound. The Stoic cuts that wire. Not out of coldness, but out of freedom. Emotion seems like a wave, but almost always it starts as a sentence. A short, quick, automatic sentence that goes unnoticed and still decides the course of your day. He disrespected me. She wanted to hurt me. I was humiliated. I'm not enough. It's going to go wrong. The emotion comes right after as if it were irrefutable proof, but most of the time it just follows the interpretation that the mind threw out first. The Stoics saw this with scary precision. It's not the event that destroys you, it's the judgment you make of the event. Life delivers facts, the mind delivers meaning, and it's in the meaning, not the fact, that emotion gains power. That's why the first Stoic habit to become emotionally firm is learning to notice the moment of interpretation. Those 2 or 3 seconds when you haven't exploded yet, haven't sent the snarky message yet, haven't responded with sarcasm yet, haven't shut down with resentment yet. In that tiny interval lives enormous freedom. That's where you realize, I'm about to react. And when you realize, you can choose. It seems simple, but it's a rare attention training in a world that pushes immediate responses. Whoever doesn't develop this habit lives on emotional autopilot, feels, interprets, reacts, regrets, repeats. The human mind has a dangerous talent. It fills gaps with stories. If someone takes a while to reply, the mind writes, ignored me. If someone is quiet, the mind writes, mad at me. If someone criticizes, the mind writes, I'm incompetent. If someone praises another person, the mind writes, I'm not valued. This automatic writing usually comes from old insecurities, wounds of rejection, fear of abandonment, pride, vanity. And here Stoic discipline isn't denying feelings, but challenging narratives. It's not about saying I feel nothing. It's about saying I'm not going to believe everything I think. A classic exercise, very Stoic in essence, is turning internal affirmations into more sober questions. Instead of they disrespected me, ask what exactly happened in terms of facts. Instead of I screwed everything up, ask what was the concrete mistake and what can I fix? Instead of, nobody cares about me, ask, do I have evidence of that, or am I interpreting from fear? The question doesn't erase the emotion, but it stops it from growing like a fire fed by wind. It gives the steering wheel back to consciousness. And it's curious how this habit even changes body posture. The person who interprets everything as an attack lives tense, defensive, ready for war. The person who learns to suspend judgment gains inner space. They don't become naive. They become precise. They don't fall into emotional traps so easily, because they notice when their own ego wants to prove something, and when the ego wants to prove, it becomes a hostage to the world. All it takes is someone poking a sensitive spot and bam, you lose your cool trying to recover dignity through victory, debate, explanation, revenge. Here's where a second habit comes in, equally transformative. Separating what's yours from what's the other's. The Stoics insisted on this because it's the most important boundary for emotional health. What's yours? Your intention, your action, your discipline, your word, your character. What's the other's? The opinion, the mood, the interpretation, the past, the traumas, the values, the choices. When you mix these things, you go crazy inside, because you try to manage territory that doesn't belong to you. You try to control how they see you, try to control how they react, try to control if they admire you, love you, respect you. And with every frustrated attempt, you feel anger, sadness, anxiety. Not because the world is cruel, but because you gave the world a power it should never have. The power to regulate your peace. Separating what's yours from what's the other's doesn't mean indifference. It means clean responsibility. You do what's right with firmness and accept that you don't control the return. In many relationships, for example, the person lives as if they need to educate the other to treat them well, insisting on endless conversations, trying to convince, trying to fix what the other doesn't want to fix. That turns into exhaustion. There are cases where a clear conversation is necessary, yes, but there's a point where insisting stops being maturity and becomes self-harm. The Stoic habit helps recognize that point. I can express my limit. I can't manufacture the other's awareness. This same principle applies to criticisms and provocations. A criticism can be useful or it can be poison. The Stoic learns to filter without getting hurt. If there's truth, he takes the truth without drama and improves. If there's no truth, he lets it pass without turning it into a wound. What destroys isn't the criticism, it's pride. Pride is that inner part that demands to be seen as impeccable, that doesn't tolerate the idea of failing, that interprets any correction as humiliation. When pride rules, emotion turns into explosion or defensiveness. When consciousness rules, emotion turns into information. And information doesn't need scandal, it needs use. There's an implicit phrase that strengthens this habit a lot. Someone else's opinion isn't a verdict, it's just a sound. It can hurt to hear, sure, especially when it comes from someone important. But hurting isn't the same as commanding. You can feel the impact and still not obey. You can recognize that this hit me, and at the same time decide, I'm not going to respond from here. That here is the place of impulse. The impulse wants to attack or beg. Consciousness wants to understand and choose. And it's at this point that the person starts becoming hard to manipulate, because emotional manipulation depends on a gap. The gap of you needing the other to change for you to be okay. When someone provokes you, they're usually trying to pull you to a specific place, the place of reactivity. If you go in, you lose. Even if you win the argument, you lose inside, because you handed over your center. The Stoic habit is not giving that gift. Sometimes the most powerful response is well-chosen silence, not that punishing silence, but the silence of someone who doesn't negotiate with chaos. Other times it's a short, firm response, without too much justification. Justifying too much is usually a disguised plea. Please understand me, please don't think badly of me. And when you need that, emotion turns into dependence. Separating what's yours from what's the other's also changes how you handle expectations. A lot of emotion explodes because you expect without declaring, demand without agreeing, charge without clarifying. And when the other fails to guess, you feel betrayed. The Stoic learns to align expectations with reality. He's not cynical, but he's sober. He understands that people have limits, inconsistencies, phases, fears. He adjusts trust to behavior, not to desire. This avoids one of the most common pains of adult life, suffering from imagining a version of the other and insisting on that imagination as if it were a contract. And when the emotion has already come strong, when the blood boiled, when sadness hit heavy, when anxiety took over the chest, that's where an internal practice comes in that seems simple and at the same time is deeply sophisticated, naming precisely what you're feeling and what you're thinking. I'm angry because I interpreted it as disrespect. I'm anxious because I want to guarantee the result. I'm sad because I expected welcoming and it didn't come. When you name it, you create distance. You stop being the emotion and start observing the emotion. That small distance is the beginning of mastery. Without it, you're dragged along. There are those who confuse emotional mastery with coldness. But what happens in truth is the opposite. Emotional mastery allows feeling with depth without becoming a hostage. Because when you don't master, you need to defend yourself all the time, and constant defense hardens you. The Stoic doesn't harden, he deepens. He learns not to make emotion a tyrant. He can love without humiliating himself, can lose without destroying himself, can be criticized without reducing himself, can be praised without inflating. Stability doesn't come from turning to stone, it comes from turning to root. And maybe the most practical aspect of these two habits, noticing the interpretation and separating territories, is the feeling that life starts to get slower inside, even if it stays fast outside. You still have problems, still have tasks, still have difficult people, still have surprises. But you don't become a slave to the first thought. You don't confuse sensation with absolute truth. You don't turn someone's opinion into the center of your value. The emotion shows up, but it finds someone home, a trained consciousness. There's a type of power that almost nobody notices until they lose it, the power to choose your own response. When emotion rises, the tongue turns into a sword, the fingers turn into a trigger, and the mind finds 1,000 justifications for a reaction that, later, you'll pay dearly for. Because words said in the heat of the moment don't just come out of the mouth. They come out of the momentary character that emotion took from you. And what hurts most isn't just the external damage. It's the intimate feeling of having been smaller than you could have been. That's why a decisive Stoic habit is learning to pause before speaking. Not out of shyness, not out of repression, but out of inner sovereignty. The pause is the difference between being governed and governing, between reacting and responding, between feeding a fire and letting the fire die without oxygen. Most people believe self-control is a talent that some have and others don't. But the Stoics would understand this as training. The mind learns to delay the reaction. And that delay, no matter how small, changes everything. The pause doesn't need to be dramatic. Sometimes it fits in a simple breath. A second where you notice your own body, the tension in the shoulders, the heat in the face, the urge to prove a point. When you notice that, you're no longer completely inside the emotion. You're partially outside, observing. And that's where discipline starts to work. Because emotion wants speed. It wants immediate action. It wants to discharge. Consciousness, on the contrary, works with time. Even if it's minimal time, it creates space. The Stoics were masters at understanding that the external world is full of stimuli, but what decides life is the internal response. If someone provokes you, the provoker is offering an invitation. Come with me to chaos. And a lot of people accept without noticing. They accept because they're in a hurry to defend themselves, hurry to be understood, hurry to show they're not weak. But when you enter that game, even if you win, you lose something more valuable. You lose serenity. And serenity can't be bought later with justifications. It's preserved with discipline before. One of the most effective habits for this is adopting a simple rule. Never respond at the peak. Never decide at the peak. Never promise at the peak. Never accuse at the peak. Because the emotional peak is a state of intoxication. You see less, hear less, interpret worse. And what you call clarity at the peak is usually just inflamed conviction. The Stoic doesn't trust the peak. He waits for the mind to return to axis. In practice, this can mean responding with a short, neutral phrase or even asking for time with dignity. I need to think before responding. Let's talk about this later. Right now, I'm not at my best to chat. A lot of people fear saying this because they think it'll seem weak. But actually, that's a sign of rare strength. It's the strength of someone who doesn't allow themselves to be dragged. Whoever has mastery doesn't need to win in the same minute. Whoever has mastery doesn't need to prove they have mastery. They simply act like someone who governs themselves. This leads us to another habit: economizing words. Emotionally unstable is the one who talks too much when hurt, who explains too much, justifies too much, defends too much. Because behind the excess of words, there's an attempt to control the image. Don't think badly of me. Understand me. See my side. But the more you try to control how the other sees you, the more you become a hostage. The Stoic understands that reputation is territory partially outside your command. What's in your command is the rightness of what you do, not the opinion they fabricate about you. Economizing words isn't turning cold or unreachable. It's learning to speak when there's need and to be silent when silence is wiser. Many arguments aren't about truth, they're about ego. And when two vanities meet, there's no conversation. There's combat. Combat to be right. Combat not to feel inferior. Combat not to yield. The Stoic avoids this theater because he knows it destroys inside. He's not a coward. He's selective. He doesn't give energy to battles that don't produce virtue, just wear. There's a delicate point. Sometimes silence is an escape. Silence can be a way to avoid legitimate conflict, to swallow resentment, to accumulate bitterness. The Stoic doesn't use silence as punishment, but as an instrument. If there's something that needs to be said, he says it with firmness and without venom. If it doesn't need to, he doesn't speak to relieve his own tension. Because speaking to relieve tension usually creates more tension later. A very Stoic practice here is asking an internal question before responding. What I'm about to say, does it improve the situation or just improve my momentary feeling? Many words are born just to relieve the ego's discomfort. You want to discharge, want to humiliate, want to win, want to show intelligence, want to expose the other's inconsistency, and you might even succeed. But the next day, what's left is the bitter taste of having fed a smaller side of yourself. The Stoics spoke of temperance, the ability not to be dominated by impulses. Temperance isn't repression, it's direction. It's like a strong horse that needs reins, not to be humiliated, but not to destroy itself. Your emotions are energy. If you don't direct them, they drag you. If you direct them, they serve you. The same anger that would make you insult can give you courage to set boundaries with clarity. The same sadness that would make you fall can make you more human, more humble, more attentive to the essential. The same anxiety that would make you run can teach you to plan better and then let go. Emotion doesn't need to be eliminated. It needs to be transmuted. And to transmute, you need distance. The pause creates distance. Economizing words creates distance. And distance allows a third habit, observing your own narrative before speaking to the world. Many times you're not speaking to the person in front of you. You're speaking to an old memory, a critical father, an absent mother, an ex who hurt, a humiliating boss. The body reacts as if it's back in that scene, and the mouth responds to the past. The Stoic learns to bring the mind to the present. Who's in front of me now isn't the ghost of the past. This reduces disproportionate reactions. This point is especially relevant because adult life is full of subtle triggers. A tone of voice, an expression, a delay, a criticism, an absence. The real world mixes with old wounds, and without training, you react as if fighting for emotional survival. What changes with the Stoic habit is that you notice the trigger without obeying it. You start saying to yourself, "This activated me, but I don't need to act from this." The activation isn't a command, it's a signal. Now, how to put this into practice in an almost immediate way? A simple method is creating a response ritual. Before responding, breathe one more time than the impulse would like. The impulse wants to respond on the first breath. You respond on the second. That second breath is a meter of sovereignty. Another method, write the response and don't send it for a few minutes. Reread it as if you were a stranger. Ask, is this aligned with the person I want to be? This kind of review is deeply Stoic because it shifts the focus from immediate relief to character. There's also a point that makes someone emotionally firm, accepting the possibility of being misunderstood without despair. This hurts, especially for those with a strong sense of justice or who need to be seen as good, but sometimes you'll be misunderstood. Sometimes out of envy, sometimes out of ignorance, sometimes out of projection. And if you try to correct everything, you live as a slave. The Stoic learns, I can clarify once, calmly, and then move on. Whoever wants to understand, understands. Whoever wants to distort, distorts. And you can't sacrifice your peace trying to educate bad will. Notice how this makes a person hard to manipulate. Emotional manipulation depends on your fear of losing the image, depends on your fear of seeming weak, depends on your fear of being judged. When you reduce these dependencies, you become less pushable. Someone can try to provoke you but doesn't find the door open, can try to blame you but you check with sobriety. Do I have real guilt here? If you do, you own it and fix it. If not, you don't carry it. That's a rare freedom. And in the end, from this video to a question that the Stoics would live in practice, do I want to be right or do I want peace with dignity? Not always possible to have both. There are moments when you'll need to speak, take a stand, correct injustices, but even in those moments you can choose how to speak. Without insult, without theatrics, without losing yourself. Mastery isn't in never getting involved, it's in getting involved without being taken over. Most people try to master emotion at the worst possible time, when already hurt, tired, provoked, or in panic. It's like wanting to learn to swim in the middle of a rough sea. At first it even seems to work, but one bigger wave and breathing fails, the body goes into despair. The Stoics had a more sober view. Whoever waits for the crisis to strengthen the mind is already late. Emotional stability doesn't come from improvisation, it comes from training. It's not a heroic shine that appears out of nowhere. It's a silent construction that, when the hard time comes, reveals itself as natural firmness. That's why certain habits change life, not because they avoid emotions, but because they reorganize the interior before the impulse turns tyrant. One of them is premeditating adversities, a practice that seems pessimistic to those who don't understand, but actually is liberating. You don't imagine the worst to suffer in advance. You imagine the worst not to become a hostage to the shock. The unprepared mind despairs not just from the fact, but from the shock of seeing the fact happen. The trained mind suffers what it has to suffer, but suffers with less panic, because it had already accepted that life includes losses, delays, criticisms, surprises. In practice, this works like this. You look at the day and recognize, with sobriety, that things can go out of control. Someone can be unfair. A plan can fail. Traffic can jam. A body can give a sign. A news can arrive. And then you ask a question that's Stoic gold. If this happens, how do I want to respond? Notice the change. You leave fear and enter character. You leave the fantasy of control and enter the choice of posture. The world remains uncertain, but you stop being fragile in the face of uncertainty. Because your peace starts to rely less on external guarantees and more on an internal decision, the decision not to abandon your dignity. Another practice that strengthens a lot is the day review, not as guilt, but as polishing. At the end of the day, or in some moment of silence, you revisit your reactions. Where did you lose your center? Where did you get irritated without need? Where did you talk too much? Where did you stay silent out of fear? Where did you act out of vanity, neediness, hurry? And mainly, where did you act well, with firmness and calm? This review creates pattern awareness. The person who doesn't observe repeats. The person who observes learns. And learning here isn't accumulating theory. It's reducing the distance between the ideal and the act. A lot of people fear this review because they think they'll find too much guilt. But the Stoic doesn't do this to whip himself. He does it to become better without drama. He understands that error is part of the training, as long as it's used as evolution material. And there's a deep psychological effect. When you commit to this daily honesty, the mind starts to act more carefully during the day, because it knows there'll be internal accountability. Not to a cruel judge, but to one's own consciousness. This creates a type of self-control that doesn't depend on explosive effort. It depends on coherence. Another essential habit is voluntary discomfort. It seems strange, but it's powerful. A big part of emotional explosions comes from addiction to comfort. The person gets used to having everything the way they want, at the time they want, with the response they want. And when reality denies, they go into shock, as if attacked. Voluntary discomfort trains the opposite. It teaches the mind to endure friction without drama. It can be something simple and safe, like resisting the urge to respond immediately, choosing a small discipline that counters laziness, reducing an excess that turned into dependence, enduring a delay without turning it into tragedy. The goal isn't to suffer for suffering. The goal is to gain inner amplitude. Whoever endures small discomforts doesn't crumble with big contrarieties. There's also a perspective habit, which the Stoics cultivated with intensity, looking at the event as part of a bigger picture. When you're in the middle of emotion, everything seems huge. A comment turns into a sentence. An error turns into identity. A stumble turns into end. Perspective corrects this distortion. You ask yourself, will this still matter in a week? In a year? In 10? Not to minimize real pains, but to stop the mind from turning anything into catastrophe. This habit doesn't erase emotion, it returns proportion. And proportion is a form of mercy to yourself. Along with perspective comes a reminder that the Stoics used not to scare, but to wake up. The awareness of finitude. When you remember that time is limited, many provocations lose their fascination. Many arguments lose importance. Many prides lose urgency. You start to choose better where to put energy, and that, by itself, strengthens emotional mastery. Because a big part of instability comes from spending energy on small things as if they were big. Finitude reorganizes priorities. It returns you to the essential, what deserves your attention, your effort, your heart. Another habit that makes someone hard to shake is independence from validation. Not in the sense of despising people, but in the sense of not basing your own value on approval. Whoever needs to be applauded lives tense. Whoever needs to be understood by all lives explaining. Whoever needs to be admired lives performing, and performing tires because you're always tending the character. The Stoic chooses another axis. He measures himself by his own consciousness, by his own commitment to what's correct. This doesn't eliminate the pain of being rejected, but it stops rejection from destroying you. You feel, but don't reduce yourself. This point is delicate, because many get confused and turn arrogant, saying, I don't care about anyone. That's just armor. The Stoic doesn't become insensitive. He becomes free. He continues valuing relationships, but without turning relationships into an altar of his own value. He can love and still keep boundaries, can hear criticisms and still preserve integrity, can recognize errors and still not hate himself. This freedom is the heart of a stable mind, feeling without dissolving. There's still a deeper habit, almost a soul posture, accepting reality without surrendering to mediocrity. It seems contradictory, but it's not. You accept what happened because denying only creates extra suffering. And at the same time, you don't use acceptance as an excuse to stay worse. Accepting is saying, this is what it is. Improving is saying, and now, what do I do with this? The emotionally firm person doesn't argue with the fact. She works with the fact. This change is huge because emotional lack of control often comes from the internal fight with the inevitable. You don't suffer just from the event. You suffer because you think it shouldn't have happened. And while you insist on that shouldn't, you remain stuck. When you accept, you move. To sustain all this, a simple but decisive habit is choosing fixed principles for variable moments. Emotions vary. The world varies. But your principles can be anchors. For example, not responding with cruelty, not lying to protect yourself, not humiliating to feel superior, not begging for attention, not betraying your own dignity to avoid discomfort. When you have clear principles, you reduce the chance of being hijacked by the moment. Because in the hour of emotion, the mind tries to negotiate, just this once. Principles prevent that kind of bargain. They don't make you rigid, they make you reliable to yourself. And there's a beautiful side effect of these habits. You start to inspire calm in others. Not by superiority, but by stability. Unstable people spread turbulence. Firm people spread inner silence. And this doesn't happen by speech. It happens by presence. The emotionally trained person doesn't need to prove anything. She's harder to provoke because she doesn't live asking for confirmation. Harder to knock down because she doesn't depend on applause to exist. Harder to manipulate because she doesn't negotiate with invented guilt or exaggerated fear. She doesn't become a fortress out of coldness, but out of lucidity. In the end, what makes someone truly untouchable isn't the absence of emotion. It's the presence of inner government. Emotions keep coming, because that's human. The difference is they find a place where they're not owners. They find a mind that observes, a heart that feels, and a consciousness that decides. And that triad, observe, feel, decide, is the portrait of an adult life. In the end, true emotional strength isn't the one that makes noise. It's not the strength of who wins arguments, imposes presence, intimidates with words, or proves superiority. That strength is fragile, because it depends on the scenario, depends on applause, on control, on being right. Stoic strength is different. It's silent, almost invisible but firm. It's the strength of who manages to cross the day without losing themselves, of who manages to feel without becoming a hostage, of who manages to be provoked without becoming a slave to impulse. Maybe you've noticed something important throughout this reflection. Emotion by itself isn't the problem. The problem is the absence of inner government. It's the lack of space between stimulus and response. It's the mind believing any rushed narrative. It's the tongue speaking before consciousness arrives. It's the need to control the other, to not face your own fear. When these mechanisms dominate, anyone can push your buttons. Any snide comment turns into a trigger. Any silence turns into a threat. Any criticism turns into humiliation. And living like that is living tired, even when everything seems normal on the outside. Emotional stability, on the contrary, is born when you change the axis. You stop asking the world for what the world can't offer. Guarantees, continuous approval, perfect justice, immediate answers. And you start building what depends on you. Clarity, discipline, temperance, courage, perspective. Not as theory, but as habit. Because in the difficult moment, you don't resort to what you know. You resort to what you trained. It's at this point that life starts to change in quality. You still feel anger, but it doesn't turn into aggression. You still feel sadness, but it doesn't turn into despair. You still feel fear, but it doesn't turn into cowardice. You're still touched, but not controlled. And that difference is everything. Because a mind that's not dragged by every emotion turns into a safe place to live. And when you live well inside yourself, you stop begging for peace outside. Stoic freedom is, above all, the freedom not to betray yourself, not betray your values for impulse, not betray your dignity for vanity, not betray your silence for the need to win, not betray your character for the need to prove. And that's rare, because the whole world pushes for reactivity. The world rewards who shouts. The world stimulates who responds fast. The world celebrates who humiliates with intelligence. But the cost of that is high. You win moments of triumph and lose years of serenity. Maybe the most practical point is this. If you want to master emotions, start with the small. Start with the pause. Start with the day review. Start with the habit of separating facts from interpretations. Start with voluntary discomfort that trains your inner no. Start by economizing words when emotion wants spectacle. Start by choosing fixed principles that protect you when everything gets variable. Because in the end, what makes you firm isn't one big unique decision. It's the set of small repeated choices. And when you live like that, something curious happens. The people around notice. Not by magic, but by presence. You become less predictable for who tries to provoke. Less vulnerable for who tries to manipulate with guilt. Less accessible for who tries to pull you into useless dramas. And at the same time, you become more reliable, more stable, more whole. Not because you turned cold, but because you learned not to hand the keys to your interior to any circumstance. If this made sense to you, leave a like to support the channel and help this content reach more people. Write in the comments which emotion usually knocks you down the most. Anger, anxiety, sadness, fear, frustration, and what you want to learn to do differently from now on. And if you want to keep deepening this kind of practical wisdom for adult life, subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who lives tired of being carried away by their own mind.